It's supposed to
and now
make it
share
work, but it
screen.
didn't. Select speaker. Go away, Judy. You're supposed to be off. Here we go. Okay. There we are.
Okay, so it looks like most of us are here. I see, Michelle, you made it. That's great. I'm sorry that there were difficulties getting the link to you, but I'm glad it worked out.
It worked up there, but it's not working.
Okay, so can you guys all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yep.
All right, if one of you can hear me, then probably all of you can. Hold on one sec. One sec. I'm going to stop the sharing for 1 sec. I'm going to turn off my video as well. It's not necessary for the speaking. And I'm going to start. And let's hope this works. All right. Okay, so welcome to this virtual tour of Jaffa. My name is Eyal. Can you guys please just close your, the first thing I need is for everyone to mute themselves. Here, I'm going to mute you. If everyone could just mute themselves so that you don't speak over me while I'm giving the talk. So we'll do this virtual tour of Jaffa. My name is Eyal, and I am a licensed tour guide in Israel. As you can imagine, these days there's not really much tourism here in Israel as anywhere else in the world. I was joking the other day, I was in Jaffa and I saw someone who was taking pictures and I thought, oh, is this a tourist? You know, like some rare animal. And I asked him and it turned out it was another tour guide preparing for a virtual tour. So the struggle is real, and we're definitely trying innovative new ways to make some, to earn some money under these difficult circumstances right now. Okay, 1 sec, let me close that. Yeah. All right, so the second thing I wanted to say is thank you for joining on Father's Day. I know that this is Father's Day in the US. It's not really celebrated here on this day. So I appreciate all of you for joining today on Father's Day. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about the inspiration for this tour. The idea behind the tour actually was because I had a group back in November, and several of them are here with us this evening, or this afternoon for you guys. And they arrived in November last year to Israel. And on the day that they landed, we were planning to go visit Jaffa. But just as they landed, just as they arrived at the airport, a group of them just arrived at, not the airport, excuse me, at the hotel in Tel Aviv. The air raid sirens went off and we all had to rush into the hotel and into the bomb shelter. And, you know, we had to shelter in place and wait and see what to do. And in the end, the tour company rightly said, get out of Tel Aviv as quickly as possible, head north to Caesarea and onwards. If you've got your microphone on, if you could just turn it off, that would be great. Let me see, sorry. Mute that. Yeah, if you guys could just mute your mics so we don't speak over. So that was really the inspiration for this tour. I wanted to kind of complete the tour because, you know, they arrived in Israel, people came all the way over here. They were already in Tel Aviv and they didn't make it to Jaffa. So that's why I wanted to start with Jaffa. Also, I'm hoping to do more than one of these tours. And I thought Jaffa is kind of nice and symbolic because Jaffa has always been the gateway to Israel in antiquity. Today we have other ports and an airport and everything, but traditionally Jaffa was the gateway to the Holy Land for all those who were coming by sea. And so that was another reason I wanted to do this, is kind of a gateway to other lectures that I'd like to give and other talks. I wanted to point out also that Jaffa is from the root in Hebrew yafeh, which means beautiful, or something which is pleasant and pleasing, something which is beautiful, yafeh. And I hope that you'll see that, as we tour Jaffa today, that it does live up to its name. It is a beautiful place. It's an ancient city with a lot of history and a lot of beauty to it. And there is really a lot to see in Jaffa. We're not going to be able to get to all of it. I've focused on some of the main sites in Jaffa, and some of the things you're just going to have to come and visit by, as soon as they open up the borders and allow people to fly, you're going to have to come and we'll go to Jaffa together and we'll go through the markets and then really get to see it. We can spend the day there and really, you can't see it all even in one day. So without further ado, I'm going to go into some background that I think is useful to understand why Jaffa has been so successful as a city for so long. Because we're talking about an ancient port city, which is really over 5,000 years old. You don't get to be 5,000 years old unless you're doing something right. And so what is it about Jaffa that has allowed it to survive so long, for 5,000 years? In fact, in Jewish tradition, the city is so old that according to Jewish tradition, it was founded by Japhet. Japhet is the son of Noah. And so we're talking about really old, from the time of the flood. After the flood, his son founded the city, and it's been there since. Now, why was the city, so important? Well, because it was along several important routes. First of all, it was along a road called the Via Maris, the Way of the Sea, and I'll show you that in a second. But I want to point out, if you look at this topographic map of Israel, we've got Jaffa right over here. This is Tel Aviv, Jaffa. And it was along this coastal road, which at this point turns inland and goes along the foothills of the mountains and then breaks through this mountain pass to continue on to Damascus, and from there on to Mesopotamia or to Anatolia. Why does it turn from Jaffa? The reason is that this whole area, in this area right here, the Sharon Plain, this is an area that was full of swamps. And so it was difficult to pass along here. And so from Jaffa, you have to go inland around the Yarkon River and the Afek Springs, which are over here. And from there, you can make it up through Megiddo. Here you'll see another map where you can see the road from Egypt, all the way up from Egypt, going up through Jaffa. And here you can see it turns, right? You can see how it turns inland at this point. And that is the Way of the Sea, the Via Maris. And that's why Jaffa was so important. It wasn't only that it was a port, and the port was a good port, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but it was along this point, just as it becomes swampy, and it provides a station to go inland, then to cross the country, and then to use these roads which go all the way to Anatolia and to Mesopotamia on the other side, the Via Maris. In fact, the road is so old that the original part of the road that went from Egypt up until Jaffa was known as the Way of Horus, because it was an Egyptian road, and it goes back to the Middle Bronze Age. And so we're talking about, somewhere in the vicinity of 1600, 1800 BC. So the Via Maris is very important to understanding why Jaffa became such an important city. And the next thing that I want to discuss is, what is it that makes a city become an important city? Or what is it that can, if you've ever played SimCity, what makes a city successful? And in terms of the success of a city, I think that there are several different components. And I think when we think about that in terms of Jaffa, we'll understand why Jaffa also has been around and succeeded for so long. So the first thing that a city needs is water, right? it needs fresh water for drinking. And the good news in Jaffa is that you can drill, and along the coastal aquifer, you can reach water quite easily. But in antiquity, it's very likely that the Ayalon River came out very close to Jaffa, and so there was a fresh water supply very close to the city, and hence water was not an issue. The second thing that a city needs is agricultural land. Agricultural land is abundant all around Jaffa. The entire area around Jaffa is good land because there's water in the area, it's good soil, and we'll talk later about the oranges and the orange groves that existed in the vicinity of Jaffa, and the fact that agriculture was central to the development of the city. During the Egyptian period, the Egyptians had storehouses in Jaffa for the grain they grew in the area, and also in the area of Afek, which I mentioned a couple minutes ago. The third thing is road connectivity, and I've already mentioned that it was on this major highway. And the last thing is defense, right? The last thing is defense, and Jaffa is built on a hill. We'll see that in a sec, how it's kind of built on this hill. It's what we would call a tell, or a hill. It's a natural hill on which was built on top afterwards. Now, Jaffa has other advantages in addition to the ones that I just mentioned, which is that it is a port as well. So you've got all of the advantages that a city needs to be successful, and you add to that a port, but not just any port, the port for one of the world's most important cities, Jerusalem. As you can see on this map, even though it's in Hebrew, you see here's Jaffa, below it is Jerusalem. Here, Jaffa, Jerusalem. It's about 60 kilometers to Jerusalem, 45 miles or so. And Jaffa, in essence, was the port city of Jerusalem. So when Jerusalem was doing well, Jaffa was flourishing. When Jerusalem was not, was in ruins, then Jaffa reverted to being a small fishing village. The last thing is that, it had this patron city, right? Since it was, not just a port, but it was the port of Jerusalem, it had this connection which helped it to really be successful throughout much of its history. Okay, so when do we hear about Jaffa for the first time in the Jewish tradition, other than the traditions surrounding, this midrashic tradition, these kind of fables or mythology around it being named after Noah's son? We see it in the book of Joshua as part of the allotment of the tribes. And we're talking about the tribe of Dan, which is allotted the area. So we can see here in the book of Joshua, we've got all the little, territories, and, this city and that city and everything. And then verse 46, it says, Me Yarkon, the waters of the Yarkon, which is a river, and Rakon, with the area facing Jaffa, belongs to Dan. Unfortunately, even though the whole region to this day is called the region of the Gush Dan, the Dan block, and you can see in this next map, when we talk about the Dan block, what we're talking about. Here we've got a map of all the 12 tribes, and here is Dan and Jaffa. Even though the region is called Dan block, the tribe of Dan wasn't actually able to capture the territory. And so some of you may have visited Tel Dan up in the north of the country. That's because they had to migrate up there in order to find a bit of land, because they weren't able to dislodge the Philistines. And you can see right here, Philistia, the Philistines who were in the area, the Canaanites as well. And so they moved on to another area. And that's what ended up, but the name stuck, and it's still called to this day Gush Dan. The whole region of Tel Aviv, Metro Tel Aviv, is known as Gush Dan. And when do we hear again about about Jaffa? Well, it appears several more times in the Bible, and we have it in the stories surrounding the building of the temple. When I say temple, I mean the first temple. So in the book of Chronicles, we have several verses here, and in particular, we can see already that in the time of King Solomon, according to Chronicles, Jaffa is already a port city which is used by Jerusalem, and it's the way that they get the logs from the north, from Lebanon, the cedars of Lebanon. that they need in order to build the temple, right? If you remember when you were around Israel, there are not many trees here which grow straight and make, can be really used for building. That's why much of the construction here is from stone. And so in order to have an ability to build with wood, they had to ship it. And the easiest way to ship it was just to, float it down the coast. And that's exactly what happened. King Hiram of Tyre, who was an ally of King Solomon, he does that. And as it says here, they ship it, they cut all the logs and float them by rafts down the sea to Jaffa, and then take them up to Jerusalem from there. So from there, it's already a short distance, right? So that's the second time we see it. Then we have a very important story, the story of Jonah, which is based on, Jonah escaping from his responsibility. God tells him, go to Nineveh, tell everyone to repent. And Jonah just wants to avoid all of this. And so what he does is he goes instead straight to Jaffa. And when he gets to Jaffa, he gets on a ship and he decides to go to Tarshish, which is in Tarsus up in Turkey. But it doesn't really end up that way. He kind of ends up in the belly of a whale, and he ends up, fulfilling God's will in the end. And so the story actually really begins. This is chapter 1, already in verse 3. He goes to Jaffa and he finds a ship and he heads for Tarshish. So Jaffa appears several times in the Bible, and we're going to see not only that it appears in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament as well. Okay. I thought we'd start with a little geography lesson here. And we can see here, we've got where you guys all are in the United States of America, the USA, the United States of America, and we're going to go across the world, across the Atlantic. You see the Mediterranean here, Africa, and we're homing in on the area of Israel. You can see Egypt to this side, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Iraq. You can see all of our neighbors. And as we zoom in, we're going to go down into the area of Tel Aviv, Jaffa. And here we've got a lot of names. For some reason, Google Earth is stuttering and they've got it twice. But here we go down to Jaffa. We're going to start with St. Peter's Church. So we're zooming into that. And in a second, we're going to get closer and get to see a little bit of the Tel, or that little hill that I mentioned, which is what provided for the defense. Here you can see the port, and here you can see the hill, which provided for the defense of the city. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. If someone can just write to me, maybe in a little chat, tell me everything, you can hear me okay, that would be great. I just want to make sure you're still there. All right, here's a map of Jaffa, a close-up. I don't know if we're going to make it to all of these. As Bob pointed out to me, like often on tours, I complain that, we have too many things. We're trying to accomplish too many things at once. I think on this tour, I got a little excited. And so I went through all of these. We'll see how far we get. But this is hopefully the goal. We'll get most of this stuff today. All right, all is good, I see. Great. All right, so these are the sites, and we're actually starting right here where it says St. Peter's Church, and we're going to continue by visiting the church. And here is this beautiful neo-Baroque church. It's a Catholic church. It was built in the year 1888, and the church was funded by the royal family of Spain. And so there's some Spanish elements in the church, especially when you go inside. I'll point out some of those Spanish elements to you. The church is in the Catholic tradition. This is the traditional site of where St. Peter spent much of his time in Jaffa. So St. Peter is invited to Jaffa by the residents in order to help save Tabitha. And we'll see the verses in a minute. He resurrects Tabitha. And then he has his famous dream where he sees the clean and unclean animals. And God tells him to eat of the animals. And he says he can't eat because they're unclean. And God says, you know, what I've made, what I've made, clean, you can eat. What I've permitted, you can eat. And so we'll read the verses. And then there's also the mission of Cornelius, who sends his servants to ask Peter to come to Caesarea. And he goes there, and Cornelius becomes the first non-Jew who accepts Christianity. And so from here, in a sense, in Jaffa, Christianity spreads out to the rest of the world. And we can kind of see it already in this church. You may not be able to tell from the picture, but we're facing towards the west. And that's not common for a church. On the one hand, the facing to the west here represents a connection with Rome. But on the other hand, it talks about from here, it spreads out to the rest of the world, right? Usually churches face to the east, but this one is facing to the west because from here, Christianity spreads out to the rest of the world. Now, there were other churches on this site before this church was built in 1888. And there was also a fortress here. We're talking about during the Crusader period. And it was destroyed. There was a fortress built by Louis IX or St. Louis. And it was destroyed by the Mamluks, like they destroyed much of the coastal belt. But then it was rebuilt in the late Ottoman or Turkish period. And so we've got a sense here a little bit about the church. And I want to go down, talk a little bit about the verses and the things that happened here. And so let's go. Next one. And here we have the story of Tabitha. And so St. Peter was in Lydda or Lod, which is not far. In fact, it's where the airport is from Jaffa. And they sent men and asked him to come. And when he came, he spoke to Tabitha. And like the story of Jesus with Talita, he tells Tabitha to get up. She opens up her eyes and sits up. And this miracle became known. And so he stayed there in Jaffa in the house of a tanner named Simon. And here, there's some interesting things about the church that I also wanted to point out from the facade. We've got here, you can see in the facade, some interesting things. So first of all, the lower level here, we've got this emblem. And this, maybe you guys, when you were here, you saw it. This is the Jerusalem cross. It's an ecumenical cross. And it's the cross of the Custodia. And up here, you've got the crossed arms of Saint Francis and also of Jesus. And so what you have here is, it's telling you it's a Catholic church, and it's a church which is part of the Custodia, which controls many of the religious sites. It was given kind of oversight over the religious sites by the Pope 800 years ago. And since then, they've kind of, maintained and protected the sites. And above it, you can see also the Holy Spirit, the dove, and the crown of glory here. But you've got also up above, you've got this cross. And the cross, you can see here, you've got right here, the cross, you've got a stone. And that stone is not there accidentally. That stone is actually there because it's connected to the story of St. Peter, right? Peter's real name is Simon, son of Jonah, but from which point does he become Peter? Well, we know that when they're in Caesarea Philippi, in Matthew chapter 16, Jesus asks, who do people say the Son of Man is? And everyone, throws out their guesses. But eventually Simon Peter answers, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus renames him. He says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, right? And I tell you that you are Peter. Peter from the word Petro, rock. Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And so what they did was they brought a rock from Caesarea Philippi. and put it on the very top here of the church to signify St. Peter's and the story of the rock and the name, to honor that story. And so that's why that is there. Okay. Now we look inside the church. It's a beautiful church, and we'll have a little video in a minute. But you see here, this beautiful church, you have the altar. Behind it, there's this painting, and we can see a little close-up here. And what we've got in this painting is the story that we have in the book of Acts also, which is the one that I was trying to say before. You've got Peter with his dream and an angel, and we've got it here in verses where he sees heaven open and something like a large sheet. So you can see the large sheet over here in the painting, right? And like a large sheet being let down to earth by its four corners, containing all four-footed animals as well as reptiles and birds. And a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." Well, you can imagine for a Jew who keeps kosher, which is what Peter is basically saying when he says, "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." That's, hard to, fathom, the idea that you would eat, snakes or reptiles, anything, birds that are unclean. But as God says to him, do not call anything impure that God has made clean, right? And then immediately after this, we've got the men sent by Cornelius found out where Simon's house was and stopped at the gate, right? And so we've got the story of Cornelius, and from here, Peter goes to Caesarea, and the rest is history. Christianity, the largest religion in terms of adherents in the world, and it begins here in Jaffa. Okay, here's the church with a wider view. So there's the painting that I just showed you. And here's a wider view of the church. You can see it's a beautiful church. As I said, neo-Baroque style. It's actually nicely lit up above with the stained glass windows there. And you can see some of the stained glass up here. These are all Spanish saints. So various saints from Spain. But the church itself is very eclectic. It actually is a place which Christians, whether they're Catholic or not, can all come and worship. And you can see here, we've got several different things going on here. We've got, on the one hand, we've got Ferdinand. That means the King Ferdinand, Isabella and Ferdinand, the one who sent Columbus on his journey. He's sainted and he's got his own stained glass window. Over here, you have the Virgen de Guadalupe, the patron saint of Mexico. She's got a nice spot here in the church. On the other side, of course, is Saint Francis. All right, this is a Franciscan church. And you can see over here the symbol of the custodia and the arms. And here, interestingly, you have a Russian Orthodox icon of the Virgin Mary and Jesus. So even the Russian Orthodox Church has a corner within the church. So it's very eclectic. It's a very welcoming place for all who want to come and worship. And here I'm going to show you a little, this is something I filmed just a few days ago. Unfortunately, the church is completely empty. There are no tourists, very few people. On Sunday, there's still locals, but you'll have a view now of the church. You can hear kind of faintly in the background, there's religious music playing. They have it on a speaker. So here's that image that I showed you. Up. Yeah, the music is very light. It's not very strong sound. Up. All right, I moved it. It's very faint, but it's in the background just a little bit. And there's St. Francis. And Santa Teresa, Saint Teresa of Avila. All right, we're back at the beginning. Over here, I wanted to show you something really interesting that has just recently been revealed and excavated. If David is still here, he might also be interested in this. I wanted to point out over here, you see this area over here? This is the church. This is a little extra here. This wasn't here 3 months ago. The city decided that they were going to build more shops over here. And before you build anything in Israel, you have to make sure that there are no antiquities there. And so what they did was they excavated the site and they discovered that there are layers of the city right here, just across from the church, that were unexcavated. And they've been excavated during this COVID period for the last 3 months. They've been excavating here. And there's some interesting finds. None of this has been reported or published or anything yet. It's still absolutely a work in progress. I think they've done the excavation. They're done with the excavating, but they're still, you know, writing things up and investigating. And you could see some interesting things here. Right here, you can see this line that I pointed out over here. You see the little bags, the sandbags. The sandbags, this line represents a floor that was found from the Ottoman period. So the Ottomans were until World War I. They were here for 400 years. This is from sometime within the Ottoman period, within the last couple hundred years, right? So anything below it is older than that. And what we've got is some really fascinating stuff here. You can see in these images here, in the first one over here, you can see down below, you see here the way that the masonry is done, where the ashlars are turned in different directions. This kind of construction is typical of the Byzantine period. And so they think this is a Byzantine era find. The Byzantine period here is from 324 AD to 638 AD or CE. And so we're talking, you know, at least 1,500 years old. Wow. And then we've got over here, they found this wall, which they know is the Byzantine wall because it continues up on the other side. So this part was within the city. The church area in the Byzantine period would have been outside of the city wall. And then over here on the right, you can see there's an arch, and this is the Ottoman period. So this is prior to the Ottoman period. It's not clear if it's from the Arab or the Byzantine period, but they've got some really interesting finds. And this is, you know, the way things work here. Everything is on layers. We've got what we call a tell. You've heard of Tel Aviv, right? Well, there's a Tel Jaffa as well. A tell is basically when you've got layers and layers and layers of city, one on top of the other. You've got the walls of the city, right? And then there's a war or an earthquake and everything tumbles down, and then they build up on top of it because they want to get higher because it provides better defense. And because we don't have rain half of the year, things accumulate better. They don't erode as much. And then you've got this situation where you've got layer upon layer. Now, sometimes it's confusing because people dig into older layers like we just saw right now. But that's what archaeologists do. They look through these different layers and they try to figure out, based on the pottery and the layers, when a certain thing, you know, was built, from which period it is. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to walk up, can you see walking up the tell? And when we get to the very summit of this tell, we've got this beautiful statue, very modern. This statue is called the Statue of Faith. And it was designed by the sculptor Daniel Caffrey, made of Galilee limestone and finished in 1975. The idea behind this statue is it's built like a gate, and it symbolizes the fact that Jaffa was the gateway to the land of Israel. And what we see here is the three patriarchs, actually, who were given the promise of the land. They were promised the land by God. And as I will show you it part by part, you'll see what I mean. So we see the gate here, and it looks like a jumble of lines, but I opened it up, I divided it up for you here. And we've got here, on the lower level, we've got Abraham. And you can see here, there's like a person being held up in his arms. That's Isaac, right? This is the sacrifice, the binding of Isaac. And over here, you can see some horns, and we'll see why. We'll go to the next time. We'll see here on the side. So we were looking from this side over here. We see the ram, and we see Abraham up here with the sword to offer the ram instead of Isaac, right? Then we've got the other side. And on the other side, also very confusing. But what we got here is Jacob sleeping. Here he is lying down with his hair. And above him, you've got angels going up and down. So the story of the ladder, right? He dreams of the ladder with the angels going up and down. So that's what we see here, the angels going up and down. And then at the very top, we've got on both sides, right here on this side, we've got people walking, and in their hands, they're holding shofars, right? You can see the shofar. This is when they enter the land of Israel. There's the Battle of Jericho, right? So they're holding the shofars. And then on the back side, it's not very, you can't see it as well here, but you can see they're holding here the ark. And so they're entering into the land with the Ark of the Covenant, right? And so this represents entry into the land of Israel, and that's why it's called the Statue of Faith, keeping the faith, staying here, and Jaffa being the gateway into the land of Israel, the promised land. And from this point, you have an amazing view of Tel Aviv, right? This is called Hapisgah Garden, or the Summit Garden. And it's at the highest point of Jaffa, surrounded by the Summit Park. And you can see some of the first neighborhoods, the red roofs over here, the first neighborhoods that were built outside of Jaffa. That's, for example, Neve Tzedek, one of the neighborhoods of Tel Aviv. And to the north here were the sands, this whole area were sand dunes on which Tel Aviv was founded, right? Tel Aviv was an idea by a guy named Akiva Weiss, who came from Romania. The story goes that he landed in Jaffa in 1906 with his family, his wife and 6 daughters. And as soon as he landed, he already had printed up flyers calling a meeting for that evening to discuss founding a new Jewish city. He wanted to create a modern Jewish city. He called it, he said he wanted to have a Jewish New York, which is kind of superfluous, right? Because New York is very Jewish. But his idea was that there would be a modern city. And in essence, it was meant to be the antithesis of Jaffa. Tel Aviv was meant to be a place where you had running water, where you had a green space, not these little alleys and, you know, tiny byways. And he lived in Jaffa for 3 years until they bought the land and began the construction on Tel Aviv. Now, the park that we're seeing here wasn't always here. This was part of Jaffa's Kasbah. This was a very populous district, but it was destroyed by the British in 1936 during the Great Arab Revolt. The British just blew up the houses, and we'll see in a minute what I mean by that. But that wasn't always there like that. Here you can see another image from Jaffa into Tel Aviv. And I also have a little video here so you can get a sense. So this was taken just a couple days ago, last Wednesday. All right. Now, hold on a sec. Over here, we can see an aerial map of this area. Here's Jaffa over here. And over here, encircled in red, it says Achuzat Bayit in Hebrew. That's the old name for Tel Aviv. This is original Tel Aviv. This is 1917. Tel Aviv founded in 1909. But the interesting thing here that I wanted to point out, look around you. All of this are sand dunes, right? And all of this are fields where they're doing agriculture. So Tel Aviv is literally built. All those high rises that you saw, all of it is built right here on the shore, on the sand dunes. And you can see Tel Aviv, very successful. We can do another tour, but I wanted you to see how quickly Tel Aviv grew. 1915, 2,700 people. From 1931 with 46,000 to 1939 in 8 years to 160,000. This is the period when Jews from Germany were escaping and came to Israel and really developed Tel Aviv. And the last thing I wanted to show over here is this aerial photograph of Jaffa, which during British times, you can see here, the British basically opened up 3 roads. They called this the anvil operation because you can see it's like an anvil, because they were revolting against the British. So they destroyed 200 houses, and many of the, the main road that cuts across Jaffa today was because of this operation. All of this was inhabited. In 1950, Jaffa is completely swallowed up by Tel Aviv and becomes part of Tel Aviv proper. Okay. All right. So as terrible as that was, and it was a tragedy, there is a silver lining in the destruction of Jaffa, and that is that it opened up this beautiful space for a park, and it opened up the opportunity to do archaeology, because if the houses were there, it would be very difficult to dig underneath the houses. And from 1955 to 1974, there was archaeology done in Jaffa, and we can see here this pit. This has become really overgrown during Corona. Usually this is all cleared out, but you see this kind of gate here and a pit. This is an archaeological dig which dug down to the Canaanite level and found also during the Egyptian period, which is the late Bronze Age, from around 1500 to 1200 BC. They found these old, they found rocks with marking, with the cartouche of Ramses II. To remind you, Ramses II is the Ramses who is the Ramses from the Exodus story. And in fact, the Egyptians had military bases in the land of Canaan during this period, right? The reason for it is that the Egyptians were invaded by a group called the Hyksos from the area of Canaan. And then after they kicked them out of Egypt, they wanted to make sure no one returned. And so for almost 300 years, they controlled this area. And they had a fort here. And you can see this is the remains of that fort. This structure, the gate that they built here, is just meant to show you, to showcase that this is where it was. This is a computerized model of what the gate would have looked like during the Egyptian time. So quite a large structure from the time of Ramses II. There were older Egyptian forts and later ones, but this is the one which was, the most impressive. And here you can see Ramses II. This is in his youth to the left. This is the way he looks today after 3,500 years. He looks a bit tired, but he's in the Egyptian Museum, and that is Ramses II. All right, so from here we're going to take a little walk, and we start walking in the direction of the little alleys of Jaffa. And as we go through these little alleys, you can see the beautiful architecture. This is mostly from the Ottoman period. The Ottomans were in the land of Israel from 1516 until 1917 or 18, depending on where. In Jaffa until 1917, it was Ottoman, and what we see in the old city is the Ottoman architecture. Okay? And if we keep going, we reach a point where we see this interesting hanging tree in a pod. It's very kind of strange. You've got this pod tree. This is actually a work of art. It was designed by a guy named Ron Morin, who was trained as a volcanologist, and he wanted to see if he could grow trees in pods. And now he does these sculptures all over the world. This one is an orange tree, which in orange season, you can actually pick oranges from it. And it's hanging here in this plaza. And it's, known as the hanging orange, right? So not surprisingly, the floating orange tree, as it's known. Oranges arrived in the land of Israel sometime during the early Muslim period. We're talking about a fruit which actually originates somewhere in Southeast Asia. And so it made its way across Eurasia and reached in around the 7th century. And they're not native. The earliest oranges were actually not even orange. They were the blood red variety of oranges. And over time, they began growing different types of oranges here. We have the Crusaders and then the French under Napoleon who were here, who remarked on the oranges and how good they were. But sometime in the last century, they managed to develop a new variety of oranges called the Shamuti variety, which you guys all know as Jaffa oranges. What was special about the Shamuti variety of oranges was that they peeled very easily. They were sweeter, and so they actually didn't spoil as much. And they didn't have many seeds, so it was easier to eat them. And they became very popular. So much so actually that it was the biggest export during the British period under the Mandate. And even as late as the 1950s, 90% of Israel's exports were oranges. In fact, when Israel was a young state in the 1950s, it made a deal with the Russian government. There were Russian lands within Israel that the Russians wanted back, and Israel said, we'll buy the lands, but they didn't have money to buy the land. So they made a deal where they said, we'll send you so many oranges, and at the end of that, we'll get the land. And so that actually happened. And large areas like the Russian compound in Jerusalem were purchased through an exchange with oranges, which is what the young state had. This statue itself is an interesting kind of commentary on the lack of connection that exists today between Jaffa and the soil. Jaffa was a town which grew oranges, which grew wheat. There were orchards and wheat fields all around the city. There was good land and a high water table. And today it's kind of disconnected. That's what the artist is trying to say here, disconnected from the land. Today, instead of growing oranges, what people grow is apartment buildings because you get a better return on your investment. And so that's what's happening these days. And now we're just gonna go through these alleys that you can see here, these little windy alleys. Here's, the oranges from that period. You can see the advertisements. There was also the Germans who lived in nearby. They grew oranges. You see Feinste Jaffa oranges of Sorona and Wilhelm. All right, here are some of the alleys. And what I wanted to point out here is that Jaffa is an area today where there are many galleries and artists. In the 1970s, Jaffa was very run down. It was a drug-infested area. People were escaping. They didn't want to live in Jaffa. It was, very tight. You can't get cars into these little streets, and the property values were very low. And so artists began moving in, and as often happens, they had a process of gentrification. And today there are many galleries and the streets are full of art. And today it's very expensive to purchase property in Jaffa. You'd be very lucky to be able to afford to get property in Jaffa. You can see some more of these streets. This is the typical Jaffa streets. This is what all of it looked like before that area that was carved out under the British. And so you can see the streets here. And here you can see some remnants actually of Turkish architecture. This on the left here above, this is a balcony. It's called an urkel. And it was a kind of hanging balcony. It was often used by women who were in purda or seclusion, so they could look out and kind of see what's going on from these little balconies, these kind of bay windows. That's a classic kind of Turkish type of architecture. And if we keep going, we get back to the church. You can see on the right, we get back to the main square, and over here is the church. This is Kedumin Square. And from here, we can look out down to the sea and to the port, and we have the interesting story of Andromeda. So what is the story of Andromeda? Well, Andromeda is the daughter of Cassiopeia and Cepheus. And Cassiopeia, who's very proud of her beautiful daughter, says that her daughter is even more beautiful than the Nereids. The Nereids were these mermaids who were the daughters of Poseidon. And when the Nereids hear this, they go and tell their dad, hey, listen, she's saying that her daughter is more beautiful than us. And Poseidon, isn't having any of it and wants to cure Cassiopeia of her hubris. And so what does he do? He sends a sea monster, because that's what, he can do. He sends a sea monster, you can see over here, known as the Cedius, and as well as a rogue wave that goes over the city. And King Cepheus asks an oracle, what should I do? And the oracle says to him, well, you have no choice. You have to sacrifice your daughter to the sea monster, and then Poseidon will stop hounding you guys, and will be abated. And so, even though he doesn't want to do this to his daughter, he ties her up on the rocks offshore. And here you can see the rocks. This is the area over here. You can see the flag. These are known as Andromeda's rocks. And this is the place where Andromeda was tied up, waiting to be eaten by the sea monster. Well, what happens? Deus ex machina, just at the right moment, Perseus, who just happened to kill Medusa, arrives on Pegasus, his winged steed, and he kills the sea monster by pulling out Medusa's head and turning the sea monster into stone. And so some of these stones that you see over here are the remnants of the sea monster. And eventually Perseus and Andromeda marry, and they have 7 sons. And according to one version, the name Jaffa actually is from the name Cassiopeia. Joppa, Jaffa, and that's how the city got its name. This is according to the Greek tradition, and it's not one that was, an entirely marginal tradition. In fact, the story is told by Pliny the Elder and by Pausanias and Strabo, and even Josephus recalls this story in his history. And so it's an ancient story that's connected to Jaffa, not only Jewish tradition and Christian tradition, but even Greek traditions were tied to this place. From here, we're gonna walk down. You can see the stairs going down. We're gonna get down to the port. And as we walk down to the port, we'll see some more of these beautiful streets of Jaffa. And you can see here, this is an entrance to the church, the Greek Orthodox Church of Simon the Tanner. And it says here in Greek, Jesu Christos Nika, Jesus Christ victorious. Nika, like the word Nike, right? The goddess of victory, the winged victory, right? So Nika, victorious. And you can see the beautiful little alleyways and tunnels and all that you see here. And we reach the port. Yeah, there's a beautiful port, the port of Jaffa, an ancient port, as I mentioned. The reason Jaffa port was such a good port was because it was a protected harbor. The ocean levels here have gone up and down throughout history. And when they've gone up and down, what happened is certain parts of the sand dunes became fossilized. And so you have these bands of sand dunes that go out into the sea, what's known as kurkar in Hebrew. And those bands of sand dunes are basically like, you know, they basically break the waves, right? They serve as these kind of breakwaters, and small ships could dock behind these breakwaters that were formed by these different successive bands of sandstone. But what's happened to the port is that starting in the 19th century, with the advent of larger ships, steamships in particular, the port wasn't deep enough. It wasn't a deep water harbor. And so people had to offload goods and themselves in the water and get onto smaller ships and then come to shore. And as you can imagine, that was dangerous. And people lost their luggage in the sea, and people fell into the water and people died. And so it was not a very good port beginning from the 19th century. And then in 1936, during the Great Arab Revolt, the Arab workers in the port strike. They had a strike for 3 years. And during that time, Jewish workers at the port and Jewish agency built another port in Tel Aviv. And so all the energy, everything shifted to the Tel Aviv port. And then finally in 1965, the Ashdod port was built. And the result was that there was no need for the Jaffa port anymore, and it was closed. Today, only fishermen use the port. In 2006, the city of Tel Aviv purchased the port and decided to turn it into an area of restaurants and shopping. And that's what we have today. Since 2006, it's been built up, and it's a very nice area. People go and they go shopping and they go to restaurants. And so that's what we have today in the port. All right. Over here, if we walk down from the port, we've got some other churches that I wanted to point out. Church on the right, you have St. Peter's here, where we saw before, but below it, we're in another church, which is the Greek Orthodox Church of St. Michael. Also a beautiful church worth a visit. And on the other side here, just below it, is another church, which is the Armenian Church. So Jaffa is very, like Israel, is very, multicultural and eclectic. There are more than one Christian group. We have, just in Jaffa alone, we have a Catholic church, we have Armenian and Greek Orthodox, we have a Coptic church, and we have different types of Orthodox churches, Melkites and others. The Armenian church is a place I wanted to stop for a second and mention, because in the Armenian church, it's connected to a very interesting story, and that is the story of Napoleon in the Holy Land. Many people don't realize that Napoleon's first expedition, the first one outside of France, was actually to Egypt and to the land of Israel, and marched from Cairo all the way along the Sinai coast, up through Gaza to Jaffa, and then on to Akko. And Napoleon, the question is, why was he here? And the answer really is that Napoleon wanted to get to India. And the shortest way to India, before there was the Suez Canal, was to capture this territory and then ferry troops from France to here and from here to India, because Napoleon's greatest enemy was the British. And so his goal was to destroy the British Empire by depriving it of the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Over here, we see an image from his capture of Jaffa. When Napoleon arrived in Jaffa, he sent messengers to the city, and the locals beheaded his messengers. And so when he captured the city, he gave his soldiers 3 days free rein to loot and pillage and do whatever they wanted. And they definitely did. They killed almost everybody in Jaffa. And what happened as a result, though, was that because of the unsanitary conditions, a plague broke out, a bubonic plague, which afflicted Napoleon's soldiers and really, demoralized his soldiers, so far from home, suffering from the plague. And you can see here, Napoleon, this is when he goes to the Armenian church, at that time they took over the Armenian church and turned it, this is the inner courtyard, they turned the Armenian church into a field hospital, and Napoleon goes to visit his soldiers. You can see here, if we do a close-up, you can see Napoleon visiting the soldiers. And like Jesus, this is the idea. This is a painting by John Gross. This painting is in the Louvre in Paris. It's from 1804. You can see that he's touching under the arm of this soldier. Over here you have a doctor touching under the arm. The bubonic plague would appear as these huge kind of masses in the lymph nodes under the arms. And Napoleon, being as brave as he was, he touches the wound kind of like Jesus, with the healing touch. But meanwhile, behind them, and this is very timely to our day and age, you have another soldier, a commander, who's got a little cloth, right, covering his mouth, right? He's trying to avoid getting sick. Speaking of cloth, the French discovered a cotton-made cloth when they invaded the land of Israel, which they used to over wounds. The cloth was from a city called Gaza, and in French it was called gauze, right? We have gauze pads to this day. Gauze is from Gaza, and it was from Napoleon's campaign. They brought back this cotton cloth that was used in the field hospitals to be used in the armies in Europe. Okay, well, Napoleon apparently learned his lesson, because as I was walking around on Wednesday, I saw this statue of Napoleon, and as you can see, he's wearing a mask. And so even Napoleon is wearing a mask today and maintaining social distance, as you can see right here in this picture. All right, I think I'm gonna end it here. That's about, I think, enough for now. There is more to see in Jaffa, a lot more to see, but I think this gives you a good intro for the older part, the old city of Jaffa. So I'm gonna stop here and open it up to questions. Hopefully you guys are still here, and if you have any questions about anything, I'll be happy to try to answer.
Tell me about the swamps that were there. Did somebody go in and actively drain the swamps, make them places where you could build, or what? How did that get converted?
Correct. All right. So that's a very interesting and good question, which leads in so many directions.
I hear another. I hear another presentation coming. It's
Is someone else? I think someone else is just talking, maybe over. In any case, that's a great question, and I'll tell you why. So, whenever there was good governance in the land, then what you had was draining of swamps. Remember, I mentioned these kind of ridges of fossilized sand dunes, what we call kurkar. Those ridges go inland and into the sea, because in different periods, the ocean was higher and lower. Now, what happens is that means that all along the coast, you have these fossilized sand dunes, and the rivers get stuck behind these sand dunes that became fossilized, and they create these swamps behind them. And so you have to open passages, and you have to drain the swamps. Now, the Crusaders were here from 1099 till 1291, with a brief interval from 1187 to 1191. Why am I telling you this? Because there were two Crusader periods. After the second Crusader kingdom was destroyed and ejected by the Mamluks realized that the Crusaders might return. And so what they did was they destroyed all the coastal cities. And when they did that, the swamps, of course, came back, and the area became malarial and pestilential, and people didn't want to live along the coast. And so if you look at history, the Jews typically throughout history, biblical history, lived in the mountains, and the Philistines lived on the coast. Today, the Jews live on the coast and the Palestinians live in the mountain areas. Why is that? That's because the land where the swamps were not areas that were healthy, right? And so when Jews started coming back in the late 19th century, when they could start coming back in the late 19th century, the only lands that the Palestinians were willing to sell at first were these coastal lands, which were swampy. And as a result, all the coastal area, Tel Aviv to Netanya to Haifa and on, and also the inland swampy areas, are areas that to this day are Jewish areas. And that's because they were purchased when they were swamps and then drained. Does that make sense?
That's excellent. Yeah.
All right, I have a question from Michelle here. How large a ship, yeah, you can also write the questions. How large a ship can navigate to Jaffa? Are the cruise ships stopping there? No, cruise ships do not stop in Jaffa. Cruise ships can only stop in Haifa or in Ashdod because it's just small ships, and it doesn't even really have a marina for little yachts. That's, you go to Jaffa port. There are some ships, some smaller vessels, but no cruise ships. So I have a question from Judy about future tours. Yeah, I actually should point that out. Let me do a little screen share for a second here. Thanks for that question. I got excited and forgot to show you that slide. Here, let's go all the way down. And we're going to screen share from here. Okay, well, we'll just go down this way. That'll work too. All right, so yeah, I'm gonna try to do another tour in 2 weeks. I'm gonna talk about the cloverleaf map that you can see here, and how I believe that this is the key to understanding the entire Middle East from before to today. Anyone who's been on one of my tours knows that I like to start my tour talking about the cloverleaf map. But usually I don't have much time to really get into all the different layers of the map. And so in 2 weeks' time, I'll send out an Eventbrite to everyone who was in this one. I'm gonna try to do another tour with this topic. Okay, let me see. Anybody have any other questions? Anybody? Bueller?
No, this is Joe Calhoun. Go back to you don't have to show the picture, but go back to the church. You showed the two pictures, and then there was a third one, something kind of like Guadalupe. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that or.
Let's see, the Virgen de Guadalupe.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
La Virgen. Let's see over here. This image, right?
Yeah.
Okay, the Virgen is on the right side. Okay, and on the left, this is Saint Francis. You can see here, Saint Francis of Assisi, and then Saint Ferdinand, who is the king of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella. And down here, this is Russian or Greek Orthodox. This is an icon. You see Mary and Jesus. Was there anything, a question about any of that?
Yeah. Tell me a little bit more about the woman on the far right.
The Virgen de Guadalupe?
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
All right.
the Virgen de Guadalupe is the patron saint of Mexico. It has to do with a vision that was seen by one of the natives after the Spanish arrive and they capture Mexico in the 16th century. I forget his name, Juan something. He has a vision where he sees the Virgin in this kind of mandala here and performs miracles. And to this day, people go to the site. There's like this huge center where there's like a rolling, like in the airports, where you can't actually stop in front of it. You get on this kind of rolling, sidewalk, moving sidewalk. And for people from Latin America, the Virgen is this, apparition of Mary, the first one in the New World, and very important to their culture and tradition. And so it comforts them to see it in the church.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Sure. Anybody
Yeah,
else? Yeah.
yeah. Could you, this is Daphna. Could you say a few words, please, about what was the sentiment of the Christians who lived in Jaffa during the 36 revolt? Were they part of the overall sentiment in the Arab community, or it really was more layered than that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it is more layered than that. And you can see that in all of the places where there are Christians, whether whether in Jerusalem or in Haifa or in Nazareth, where you still have, you still have Christian communities. And the reason is that even though they speak Arabic and their sense of nationality is Arab, they also, are kind of trapped in between the Jewish nationalist struggle and the Arab Muslim nationalist struggle. So while certainly they were openly supportive of the Great Arab Revolt, on a private level, they were often good ties. If you read, for example, if you read, excuse me, the different underground movements, sorry, I got something in my throat. The different underground movements, they often had good connections with local Christians who worked as spies for them and helped them during the War of Independence and in 1936 as well, because they were conflicted about what would happen, under Muslim rule. Under Turkish rule, Jews and Christians were second-class citizens who had to pay extra taxes, right? They were what was known as dhimmis. And there were a lot of prohibitions about what Christians couldn't do. In fact, the fact that the church was built in 1888 has to do with the fact that there were no churches. Why? Because they were destroyed by the Muslims during the Mamluk and the Turkish periods. And it was only after what was the really, defining moment in the Middle East was actually the Crimean War, which happened, in Crimea between Russia and Britain and France. And the reason is because at the end of that war, the Turks who received help from France and Britain had to commit to allowing Jews and Christians to live again in the land of Israel and to build churches and synagogues. And so there was a lot of conflicted feelings by the Christian community. And to this day, often what you have is Christians like they have Arameans today who can get their own name on their identity card. It says Aramean and not Arab. Or you have other Arab Christians like, George Habash, who was the head of the PFLP, Palestinian Front, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, who went out of their way to be more nationalistic so that they would have the support, they would show the other Arabs that, they have nothing to fear, that they're Christians, but they support the nationalist cause. There is a good question here. Why is Francis so revered in the church there? So Francis actually did spend time. He actually visited the Holy Land. It was 800 years ago last year. And he was in Jaffa and he writes about it. And so that's why he's revered. But in general, Francis is revered in Christianity because Francis kind of embodied the attributes of Christ, right? Francis even had stigmata in his hands. He had the wounds, and he made Christianity into something very personal for people. he represented this kind of inner turn in Christianity, especially at a period, if you think about the Middle Ages, was a period where there was a lot of chaos, there was disease, there was upheaval, there were the Crusades, there were a lot of death and dying, and people were looking for, you know, a personal relationship with God. And so Francis kind of embodied that, and that's why he was so important for Christians in that period. Any other questions? Thoughts, ideas? Oh, thank you. So, like I said, in 2 weeks' time, I'm going to do another Zoom lecture. It's not going to be so much a tour. That one is going to be more lecture-like in the sense that we're going to deal with a topic. And you guys are, of course, welcome to come back and hear that lecture. If you had any questions that you want to ask me afterwards, please feel free to contact me, and I'll be happy to, you know, try to answer any question that you may have. And I really appreciate you guys doing this for me. As you know, like I said in the beginning, the tourism situation here is not good, and we don't know when it's going to get better. And so this is really a great opportunity for me to still guide, and also, you know, to be able to, you know, make a little bit of money on this, you know, during this difficult time. So I appreciate it. I really, really appreciate you guys joining me here today. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been fascinating, and I look forward to the next one.
Great. Thank you so much.
Take care.
All right. You too.
It was fantastic, Eyal. It was great seeing you again, and I look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks. I will definitely be there.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. Say hi to the whole family.
Yep,
Thank
Taylor's
you.
yelling in the background.
I think I heard Gabriel back there.
Yes, that's me.
Hi, Gabriel. I didn't get a
I
chance.
don't know if you can see me.
No, I can't see you, but it's good to hear your
don't know.
voice.
I'm not sure. Yes. But anyway, good job. I enjoyed it.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining.
Yeah. Next time. Yeah.
Oh, there you are.
Oh, now you can see me.
Now I can see you.
One suggestion.
Oh,
I
good.
think it might be fun to stop at some of the galleries.
That's a great idea. You know, when I was there, they were all closed. I went in the wrong. I think a lot of them are also just closed because of Corona. There was really no.
I know. Well, whenever you can, they might enjoy having
a great idea. There's so much beautiful art there.
I know. So people might like to see what's available, and
yeah,
and the artists would really appreciate you showing their work. So
true.
It's a win-win.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, say hi to Kathy and your daughters, and you know, we'll be in touch. I hope you know. Maybe
thank you.
Next
Yeah.
time. Well.
Yeah. Where's your beard? You had a Corona beard, no?
I have a beard still, but you know, I'm keeping
a little bit longer.
Yeah, it was long. Now it's longer. Before it was long. Before it
no,
was,
it was longer. Last picture I saw was a little bit longer.
Yeah.
You look good.
Trying to like be a little more fashionable.
All right. Well, again, thank you. It was great.
All right, thank you.
I enjoyed it. Take care.
Thank you. Lito.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. I enjoyed this quite a bit.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I don't know if I can make 2 weeks. I have a standing rehearsal on the afternoons, Sunday afternoons here. And,
okay. This would be like, it would be something like 12 o'clock. I don't know what time your rehearsal starts. 12 o'clock Eastern time.
No.
Can I get it?
11 o'clock in
it's a
Central.
bit earlier than.
You want some tramadol?
It's a bit earlier
Hold on a
than today.
Why? Is it?
I think I muted you by accident. Anyways,
Okay.
write to me, Bob, and we'll see. Maybe I can also just send you the recording afterward. That's fine too. Okay. All right.
ביי, אייל.
ביי.
ביי.
יופי, יורדד.
יופי. נהניתם?
מאוד נהנינו, מאוד.
יופי.
הנה, קיבלתי מדפנה, היא כתבה לי, וואו, זה היה מרתק. וחמוד כזה,
טוב, יופי.
מהחברה שלי.
אוקיי. יאללה.
דפנה.
אז אני זז.
אוקיי, יאללה, היה משגע, ובאמת,
אני צריך
זה
לקום.
רעיון מצוין. יש עוד רעיון שמיכל אמרה לי, שזה גם יכול להיות עם אוכל.
זה גם רעיון טוב, נכון? נכון.
אוקיי. טוב, אתה צריך בטח לסגור.
אני חייב לסגור, כי אני קם בעוד 5 שעות, יש לי השתלמות מחר.
אוקיי. או איזה השתלמות?
בגליל.
אוקיי.